The giant dome of the Galactic Council was filled with angry voices from 47 different alien species. Admiral Temin stood in the middle of the circle where they put people on trial. His old face showed no feelings, even though the aliens around him were shouting and pointing at the big screens that showed what humans had done in the last war. Commander Hyjin watched from the viewing area. Above, she was gripping the metal rail so hard her hands were white. She had fought next to Taemin for 15 years and had seen what humans could do when they were pushed too far. The screens were showing their unit during the battle at Korath Prime, where they had stopped a whole enemy fleet with just their brave fighting and smart tricks. The first alien to speak was from the Altarian race. He looked like a walking crystal that sparkled with angry light. His people had been making peace between warring species for thousands of years. They always tried to solve problems by talking, but he said humans were different. Humans turned every small fight into a big war. They did not know how to fight just a little bit. When humans fought, they fought to win everything, no matter what it cost them or anyone else. Captain Jing Wu was the youngest human officer there. He moved uncomfortably in his seat as the aliens kept saying bad things about humans. He remembered his first time in battle and how shocked he was to learn that other alien species would run away when the enemy had more soldiers. Human soldiers were taught that running away just meant you had to find a better place to attack from. The idea of giving up land or accepting defeat was something humans could never understand. The war they were talking about had started as a small fight between two minor alien races over some border planets. The normal Galactic Council rule was to send peacekeeping forces to make a safe zone between the fighters and help them talk out their problems. But when the human forces arrived, they did not just make a safe zone. They completely destroyed both armies, took over the planets they were fighting about, made a new government, and started building roads and cities. The war ended in 3 weeks instead of the 3 years everyone thought it would take. Dr. So Young was humanity's best scientist who studied alien life. She had tried to explain to the council that humans were born to be hunters who never gave up chasing their prey until it died from being too tired. This hunting instinct was why humans fought the way they did. Other alien species fought like animals in nature, having fighting seasons and rest seasons. Humans fought until their enemy was completely gone and could never be a threat again. The idea of seasonal warfare, where armies would stop fighting when the weather got bad and start again when it got better, was completely strange to human thinking. Every alien species voted the same way except for the 3 human representatives. Starting right now, human military forces were banned from all war zones in the galaxy. They could only defend their own planets and help with things like medical aid and food for refugees. Any human military ship found in areas where there was fighting would be considered a criminal and dealt with by force. The Council thought this would make the galaxy more stable and let conflicts be solved the traditional way without human interference. When the voting hammer came down, Taemin finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but everyone in the huge room could hear him. He simply said that humans would do what the Council decided, but he warned them that the galaxy might not be ready for what would happen next. Hyjin saw something in his face that made her stomach feel sick. It was not anger or sadness, it was pity, like he felt sorry for them. The human delegation walked out without saying anything else, while all the other alien species celebrated what they thought was a victory. For civilized warfare, they had no idea that they had just removed the galaxy's best protection against the terrible things hiding in the dark empty spaces at the edge of known space. They also did not know that their carefully balanced peace was about to face its biggest test ever. The Altarian ambassador felt very proud as he watched the humans leave. He had spent his whole long life studying war and peace. His crystal body glowed brighter when he was happy and right. Now he was glowing like a small star. He believed that without humans interfering, every future conflict could be solved through proper negotiation and limited military action, the way it had been done for centuries. But in the back rows of the viewing area, some of the older alien representatives looked worried. They remembered stories their grandparents had told them about the old days before the Galactic Council, when wars lasted for generations and whole star systems were destroyed. These ancient aliens had lived through the time of burning, when entire civilizations had vanished overnight. They knew that the current peace had only existed because everyone agreed to follow the same rules of limited warfare. Commander Hyjin stayed in the viewing Arya, long after everyone else had left, she stared down at the empty speaking circle where Taemin had stood. The huge dome felt cold and empty now. She thought about all the battles she had fought alongside human soldiers and how they never gave up. Even when the situation seemed hopeless, other alien species would retreat and regroup when they faced bad odds. Humans would find a way to win or die trying. She remembered the siege of Korath, Prime, that the Council had shown on their screens. What they had not shown was why the humans had fought so hard. The planet below had 3 million civilian refugees from a dozen different alien species. If the human fleet had retreated, those people would have died. The Vorthan attack fleet had made it clear they were going to destroy everything on the planet's surface. Human military doctrine said that protecting innocent life was worth any cost, even if it meant breaking the rules of civilized warfare. As Hyjin finally walked toward the exit, she passed a group of young alien officers who were celebrating the decision. They were laughing and talking about how much easier their jobs would be now without humans complicating every situation. She wanted to stop and tell them they had no idea what they had just done, but she knew they would not listen. They would learn soon enough. The transport back to human space was quiet. Admiral Taemin sat in his command chair, staring out at the stars through the main viewing window. Captain Jinwoo finally worked up the courage to ask what the Admiral had meant by his warning to the Council. Taemin was quiet for a long time before he answered. He said that for the past 1,000 years humans had been the galaxy's guard dogs. Nobody wanted to admit it, but the reason there had been so few major wars was because everyone knew that if things got too bad, the humans would get involved and end it quickly and permanently. Now that protection was gone, he explained that there were things in the dark spaces between star systems that the Council had forgotten about, ancient threats that had been sleeping for centuries. The careful balance of limited warfare had worked because it never created the kind of chaos that might wake up these old dangers. But now if something really bad happened, the galaxy would have to face it using the same gentle methods that had just failed to stop two minor species from fighting over empty planets. As their ship jumped to hyperspace heading back to human territory, Admiral Taemin made a final log entry. He recorded his prediction that within 1 year the Galactic Council would regret their decision, but by then it might be too late to fix the mistake they had just made. The galaxy was about to learn the hard way why humans had become the dominant military force in known space, and why sometimes the cure for chaos was controlled violence applied by people willing to pay any price for victory. 3 months after the Council banned humans from Warzones, the deep space watching stations started picking up strange energy signals from the void sector. This was a part of space that had been marked as forbidden for over 2,000 years. The signals were unlike anything in the galactic computer files, but they made old warning systems start flashing red. These were warnings left by a species so ancient that most people thought they were just stories. Dr. Minho was working alone at the research station Kepler-7 when he first understood what the energy patterns meant. He was a quiet man who spent most of his time studying star charts and old alien languages. His hands started shaking when he realized the signals were not random. They were counting down like a giant timer, and the numbers were getting very close to zero. The ancient warnings talked about something called the Devourers. Dr. Minho had spent years translating the old texts that most scholars ignored. These were messages left by the architects, a race that had vanished so long ago that some people thought they never existed at all. But the warnings were clear. The architects had not just disappeared, they had been eaten, and now the things that ate them were waking up. The Devourers were not like any enemy the galaxy had ever seen. They did not want to conquer planets or steal resources. They consumed entire star systems, breaking everything down into tiny pieces and turning it into more of themselves. They were like a disease that grew stronger every time it infected something new. Even worse, they could adapt to any weapon used against them, becoming immune to the same attack twice. Captain Sung-ho commanded the first Galactic Council task force, sent to investigate the strange signals. His ship carried crew members from many different alien species, the best strategists from the Crystal Altarians, the strongest warriors from the lizard-like Vorthans, the smartest engineers from the metal Nexians, and representatives from dozens of other races. They flew toward the void sector, feeling confident that their combined knowledge would be enough to handle whatever they found. The first Devourer scout ship they met was as big as a small moon. It moved through space like a living animal, with its surface rippling in patterns that hurt to look at. When they tried to talk to it, the creature responded by releasing millions of smaller things that swarmed toward the Council fleet. Each small creature was about the size of a fighter ship, but they all moved together like they shared one brain. The battle lasted 6 hours. The Council forces used every weapon they had, from plasma cannons that shot super hot gas to quantum torpedoes that could blow up entire asteroids. Each attack worked, at first destroying hundreds of the smaller creatures, but within minutes the swarm learned how to protect itself. Energy shields appeared that bounced their weapons away, and the creatures started changing how they fought to counter every move. The Council forces made Lieutenant J. Hyun was monitoring radio communications from the human fleet that was stationed at the border of Council space, waiting and watching. He could only listen in horror as the task force was slowly torn apart. The Devourers did not just destroy the ships, they broke them into pieces and absorbed the wreckage, growing larger and more complex with each vessel they consumed. By the end of the fight, there were more Devourer creatures than when the battle started. Only 3 ships escaped to tell the Council what had happened. Captain Sung-ho's vessel limped back to the nearest space station with holes in every section and less than half his crew still alive. His report sent shock waves through the galactic government. The enemy was unlike anything they had ever fought. It learned from every battle, adapted to every tactic, and grew stronger from every defeat it caused. Dr. Minho received the battle reports at his isolated research station and immediately began comparing them to the ancient architect warnings. Everything matched perfectly. The text described creatures that consumed knowledge as well as matter, that grew more intelligent. With every civilization they destroyed, the architects had tried every weapon, every strategy, every diplomatic approach. Nothing had worked. The Devourers simply learned from each attempt and became immune to it. Emergency meetings were called across the galaxy. Military leaders who had spent centuries perfecting the art of limited warfare suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that did not understand limits. The Devourers did not negotiate, did not retreat, and did not show mercy. They simply ate everything in their path and moved on to the next target. More reports came in from the outer colonies, and a terrifying pattern emerged. The Devourers were not attacking randomly, they were following the ancient hyperspace routes, the same paths that connected all the major civilizations. They were heading directly toward the galaxy's most populated star systems, and nothing in the Council's military seemed able to stop them. The second wave of attacks came just 1 week after the first. The Devourers had grown and changed, using what they learned from destroying Captain Sung-ho's task force. Now they moved faster, hit harder, and seemed to know exactly what weapons the Council forces would use against them before the Council ships could even get into firing range. The creatures were already adapting their defenses. Commander Hyjin watched the battle reports from her position at the human observation post. Her people were still banned from helping, but they were keeping careful track of everything that happened. She could see patterns in the Devourer attacks that the Council forces were missing. The creatures were not just learning about weapons and tactics, they were learning about how different alien species thought and fought. Captain Sung-ho sent his final transmission as his repaired ship was destroyed in the second battle. He warned that the Devourers were displaying signs of collective intelligence. They were sharing knowledge instantly across their entire species. Every lesson learned by one creature was immediately known by all the others. This meant that any tactic that failed once would never work again anywhere in the galaxy. Dr. Minho made a discovery that chilled him to the bone. The ancient architect texts mentioned that the Devourers grew more dangerous the more they consumed, not just physically but mentally. They absorbed the knowledge and memories of everything they destroyed. After consuming the architects, the creatures had gained all of their advanced technology and scientific knowledge. Now they were starting to consume galactic civilization. The Outer Rim colonies began sending desperate evacuation requests, but there was nowhere safe to run. The Devourers were spreading along every major space route, cutting off escape paths and surrounding entire star systems. The creatures seemed to understand galactic geography better than most space navigators. They knew exactly where to attack to cause maximum damage and prevent organized resistance. Lieutenant J. Hyun received orders to maintain radio silence and continue monitoring. He wanted desperately to help, but the human fleet was still bound by the Council's ban. All he could do was watch as species after species fell to an enemy that grew stronger with every victory. The irony was not lost on him. The Council had banned humans to prevent unlimited warfare, and now they faced an enemy that represented unlimited warfare in its purest form. The worst part was how fast the Devourers learned after consuming just a few Council fleets. They began using Council tactics against their former owners. They formed battle lines, executed complex maneuvers, and even began using captured weapons more effectively than the original crews. The creatures were becoming a twisted mirror of galactic civilization, using everything they consumed to become more deadly. As the reports grew more desperate, Dr. Minho sent his research to every major government in the galaxy. His message was simple and terrifying: the Devourers were following the exact same pattern that had destroyed the architects thousands of years ago. The ancient warnings were not just historical records, they were predictions of what was happening right now, and according to those same warnings, the galaxy had maybe 6 months before the creatures reached the core worlds where billions of civilians lived in undefended cities. The final transmission from the Outer Rim came from a research station that was about to be overrun. The scientist sending the message had one last piece of information that made everything worse. The Devourers were not just consuming matter and energy, they were consuming time itself, somehow speeding up their own development while slowing down their enemy's response. The galaxy was running out of time faster than anyone had calculated. The second battle of the Void Sector was supposed to be the galaxy's final answer to the Devourer threat. Fleet Admiral Kethvar of the Altarian Navy brought together the largest military force in galactic history, over 3,000 ships from 40 different species, representing every advancement in military technology developed over the past 1,000 years. They came with a battle plan that had been created by the greatest strategic minds in known space. Major Eugene watched the battle from the human observation post at New Sol Station. She could see the massive fleet spread out in perfect formation, creating overlapping fields of fire that should have been able to destroy anything that entered their attack zone. The Altarian military doctrine emphasized precise, coordinated strikes that would maximize damage while keeping their own losses as low as possible. It was warfare treated like art, refined over centuries of limited conflicts. The Devourers came out of hyperspace like a plague of insects. The main swarm had grown to over 1 million individual creatures, each one larger and more complex than those seen in the first battle. They moved in patterns that made no sense to normal military thinking, flowing around the Council's formations like water flowing around rocks. When the Council forces started shooting, the first attacks were devastating, destroying thousands of the creatures in brilliant flashes of energy. But the Devourers learned within 1 hour. They had adapted to every weapon frequency, every targeting system, every tactical formation the Council used. Even worse, they began showing behaviors that suggested they were not just adapting but actually thinking. They started targeting specific types of ships, going after command vessels and supply ships, while ignoring the heavily armed battle cruisers that posed the greatest immediate threat. Colonel Dong Hyan was watching from the human fleet, even though they were banned from helping. He found himself giving tactical advice to any Council commander who would listen to him. His species had studied the ancient warnings more carefully than most, and he could see patterns that the other species missed. The Devourers were not just adapting to weapons, they were learning how the Council's military hierarchy worked, how their communication networks operated, and how their different species worked together. The breaking point came when the Devourers began copying Council tactics. They formed their own battle lines, executed coordinated flanking attacks, and even began using captured ship technology against its former owners. The creatures were not just consuming matter, they were consuming knowledge, taking everything they learned from each fight and adding it to their collective intelligence. Captain Unesio watched in disbelief as a group of Devourers executed a perfect Vorthan pincer movement, a tactic that took Vorthan officers years to master. They had learned it from studying the battle patterns of destroyed Vorthan ships, and now they were using it better than many actual Vorthan commanders. The realization hit the Council forces like a physical blow. They were not fighting an enemy, they were fighting an evolving mirror of themselves. The retreat order came after 18 hours of continuous battle. The Council had lost over 60% of their fleet, while the Devourer swarm had actually grown larger. Every destroyed Council ship provided raw materials and tactical knowledge that made the enemy stronger. Traditional warfare was not just useless against this threat. It was actively making things worse. Fleet Admiral Kethvar's final message before his flagship was consumed was a desperate plea for any species with different military ideas to come forward. The careful, calculated warfare that had kept galactic peace for centuries was worse than useless against an enemy that could learn and adapt to any strategy within hours of seeing it. Dr. Minho received the battle data at his research station and immediately began analyzing the Devourer behavior patterns. What he found was even more terrifying than he had expected. The creatures were not just learning from individual battles. They were learning from the entire concept of organized warfare itself. They had absorbed the military knowledge of dozens of species and were now combining technologies and tactics in ways that should not have been possible. Survivors brought back reports that chilled military leaders across known space. The Devourers had begun building new types of creatures, combining technologies from different species in impossible ways. They were creating hybrid entities that used Altarian shields, Vorthan weapons, and Nexian engines, all in the same body. The enemy was becoming a twisted combination of everything the galaxy had to offer. Major Eugene compiled a report for the human military leadership that painted a grim picture. The Devourers had consumed not just ships and crews, but the accumulated military wisdom of the galaxy's finest minds. They now possessed tactical knowledge that had taken centuries to develop, combined with an ability to adapt that no organic species could match. The third wave of attacks began before the Council forces could regroup. This time, the Devourers did not wait for the Council to come to them. Instead, they launched coordinated attacks on 17 different star systems simultaneously. Each attack used different tactics specifically designed to counter the defenses of that particular system. It was as if the creatures had studied every Council military base and developed custom strategies for each one. Captain Sungho had survived the second battle and was now commanding one of the few remaining Council task forces. He watched helplessly as Devourer forces used his own species tactics against a Vorthan defense fleet. The creatures had learned Altarian strategy so well that they were predicting Vorthan moves before the Vorthan commanders had even made their decisions. The psychological impact on the Council forces was devastating. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives to fight according to established doctrines found themselves facing an enemy that knew their every move before they made it. Morale collapsed as fleet after fleet was destroyed by creatures using their own tactics against them. Commander Hyjin received reports from human intelligence agents scattered throughout Council space. The Devourers were no longer just consuming military targets. They had begun systematically destroying research facilities, universities, and libraries. They were erasing the knowledge base that civilizations needed to develop new weapons or tactics. The creatures understood that information was as valuable as raw materials. The Council's emergency session was held on Sanctuary Station, one of the most heavily defended installations in known space. Representatives from every member species gathered to address the crisis that was consuming entire star systems on the galaxy's rim. The Devourers had broken through every defensive line, adapted to every weapon, and were now less than 6 months away from reaching the core worlds. Dr. Minho was invited to present his research to the full Council. His findings were clear and terrifying. The Devourers were not just a military threat. They were an extinction-level event that would consume all organic life in the galaxy. The ancient architect warnings had been understated. If anything, the reality was worse than the most pessimistic predictions. The debate that followed was unlike anything in the Council's history. Species that had banned human involvement now found themselves facing annihilation. Every conventional military doctrine had failed. Every advanced weapon had been turned against its creators. Every tactical innovation had been absorbed and improved upon by the enemy. Lieutenant Jae-hyun monitored the Council proceedings from his post at the Human Observation Station. He could see the growing desperation in the alien representatives as report after report confirmed that their military forces were not just losing but actively helping the enemy grow. Stronger, each defeat provided the Devourers with more knowledge, more resources, and more ways to destroy the next target. The final straw came when the Devourers attacked and consumed the Nexian home fleet in less than 4 hours using purely Nexian tactics. The creatures had learned to fight like Nexians better than the Nexians themselves could. The proud species that had never lost a space battle in their recorded history was destroyed by an enemy using their own strategies and weapons as. The session continued into its third day. One thing became clear to everyone present. The galaxy needed help from someone who fought differently from everyone else, someone who did not follow the established rules of civilized warfare, someone who might be unpredictable enough that even the Devourers could not adapt to them quickly enough. The age of traditional galactic warfare was over. The time had come to ask for help from the one species that had never learned to fight by the rules. The emergency session of the Galactic Council took place on Sanctuary Station, one of the most heavily defended installations in known space. Representatives from every member species had gathered to address the crisis that was consuming entire star systems on the galaxy's rim. The Devourers had broken through every defensive line, adapted to every weapon, and were now less than 6 months away from reaching the core worlds where billions of civilians lived. Ambassador Hyun-woo sat in the human delegations section, which had been moved to the back of the chamber. Since the military ban, he watched as species after species stood up to describe their failures against the growing threat. The proud Vorthan military, which had been undefeated for 3 centuries, had lost 7 entire fleets. The technologically advanced Nexians had seen their most sophisticated weapons turned against them within hours of using them. Chancellor Zevthal of the Altarian Confederacy rose to address the assembly. His crystalline form, which normally glowed with confidence, seemed dimmed by recent events. He spoke about evacuation plans, about strategic withdrawals to more defensible positions, about the need to preserve what remained of galactic civilization. But his words sounded hollow. Everyone in the chamber knew that the Devourers could not be stopped by normal methods. Dr. Haeyoung was humanity's foremost expert on swarm intelligence and had been studying the enemy's behavior patterns from the safety of human space. Her analysis painted a grim picture. The Devourers were not just expanding randomly. They were following a specific pattern, one that would allow them to consume the galaxy's industrial capacity first, then move on to the populated worlds. They were smart enough to secure their supply lines before moving to their final targets. The moment everyone had been dreading finally arrived. High Chancellor Mordeth, the Council's most senior member, stood at the central podium. His ancient voice carried the weight of centuries as he spoke words that would have been unthinkable just a year before. The Galactic Council formally requested that humanity provide military assistance against the Devourer threat despite the ban that had been unanimously voted into place. The chamber fell completely silent as Ambassador Hyun-woo rose to respond. He was a career diplomat chosen specifically for his ability to navigate the complex politics of galactic governance. But the words he spoke came from a deeper place than political calculation. He reminded the assembly of the warnings his people had given, the predictions that had been dismissed as human warmongering. He spoke of the 3 months humanity had spent watching the galaxy burn while being forbidden to help. Representative Jiho from the Human Military Liaison Office provided the Council with a sobering assessment. Human forces had been tracking the Devourer advance, running computer simulations and developing countermeasures. But they had also been respecting the Council's ban, remaining in human space while the rest of the galaxy faced annihilation. The infrastructure needed to mount an effective defense would take time to deploy, time that might no longer be available. Debate that followed was unlike anything in the Council's history. Species that had banned human involvement now pleaded for human intervention. They offered territorial concessions, technology transfers, and permanent seats on various councils, but the humans' response was measured and careful. They would help, but only on their terms, and only if the galaxy was prepared for what human warfare actually meant. Captain Somin represented the human military and outlined the conditions for human involvement. There would be no restricted engagement zones, no protected targets, and no rules of warfare beyond the complete destruction of the enemy. Human forces would operate under human command using human tactics without interference from Council oversight. Any species that could not accept these terms was free to continue fighting the Devourers using their own methods. The Altarian delegation was the first to object. They argued that unrestricted warfare would be as dangerous as the Devourers themselves. They had spent centuries developing rules of engagement that prevented conflicts from escalating into total war. The idea of giving humans complete freedom to fight however they wanted was almost as terrifying as facing extinction. Hey Young stood to address these concerns. She explained that the Devourers represented a unique threat that could not be countered by conventional military thinking. The creatures adapted to logical tactical patterns, but human warfare was often deliberately illogical. She warned that any attempt to restrict human tactics would simply provide the enemy with more predictable patterns to learn from. Chancellor Zevthal asked what guarantees the Council would have that humans would not turn their unrestricted warfare against other species once the Devourer threat was eliminated. Ambassador Heinwu's response was simple and direct. Humans had never shown aggression toward species that did not threaten them first, but he also made it clear that the galaxy's survival was more important than political concerns about human power. The Vorthan representative demanded to know why humans thought they could succeed where every other species had failed. Captain Somin's answer was brutally honest. Human military doctrine was based on the assumption that rules were meant to be broken. Every human officer was trained to find ways around limitations to use whatever worked, regardless of whether it was considered fair or civilized. Other species fought to win within acceptable parameters. Humans fought to win. Commander Hyjin provided tactical analysis from the human observation posts. She explained that human forces had identified 17 different approaches to fighting the Devourers, none of which had been tried by Council forces. The key was not to fight the creatures on their terms, but to force them to adapt to completely alien ways of thinking. The most disturbing part of the human presentation was their casualty projections. Captain Somin stated, matter of factly, that human forces expected to lose between 30 and 50% of their personnel in any effective campaign against the Devourers. The numbers shocked the Council representatives who were used to conflicts where losing 5% of a force was considered catastrophic. Lieutenant J. Hyan transmitted real-time updates to the human military command. His superiors wanted to know exactly what terms the Council was willing to accept. The human fleet was already mobilizing, but they would not move until they had complete freedom of action. Any restrictions or oversight would doom the mission to failure. The vote was closer than many had expected. Several species, even facing extinction, were reluctant to give humans the free hand they demanded. The memory of human warfare was still fresh, and many representatives feared that humanity might be as dangerous as the Devourers themselves. But as reports came in of 3 more core worlds falling to the enemy, the final votes were cast. The Nexian delegation provided the deciding votes after their home system fell to a Devourer attack that used purely Nexian tactics against them. The realization that their own military knowledge was being used to destroy them was the final straw. They voted to accept human terms unconditionally by a margin of 32 to 15. The Galactic Council voted to lift the ban on human military involvement and accept their conditions for engagement. The chamber erupted in mixed reactions of relief and terror as species realized they had just unleashed the one force in the galaxy that even they feared. As the gavel fell, Ambassador Heinwu made one final statement that sent chills through the assembly. He warned them that they were about to see why humanity had been banned from Warzones in the first place. He suggested that they might want to recall their observation teams from the combat zones unless they were prepared for what they would witness. Captain Somin added that human forces would begin deployment within 72 hours, but warned that Council species should stay clear of human operational areas. Human tactics often involved acceptable losses that other species would consider war crimes. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes survival required abandoning every principle of civilized behavior. The emergency powers granted to human forces were unprecedented in galactic history. No species had ever been given complete military autonomy in Council space, but the alternatives were extinction or watching helplessly as the Devourers consumed everything they had built over millennia as the human delegation left the chamber to begin preparations. The remaining representatives sat in stunned silence. They had just voted to unleash the most dangerous military force in known space against an enemy that grew stronger from every conventional attack. The next few months would determine whether their decision would save the galaxy or damn it to a different kind of destruction. The age of civilized warfare was over. The time for human warfare had begun, and nobody, not even the humans themselves, knew exactly what that would mean for the future of galactic civilization. The human war machine mobilized with a speed that shocked even their closest allies within 72 hours of the Council's vote. Admiral Kyung-soo's First Fleet had jumped to the Outer Rim carrying weapons and tactics that had been developed in secret during the 3 months of forced isolation. The galaxy was about to learn that humans had used their exile to prepare for a war unlike anything in recorded history. Commander Soo-jin stood on the bridge of the battlecruiser Indomitable, watching as human forces deployed in patterns that violated every principle of conventional military doctrine. Instead of maintaining safe distances and coordinated formations, human ships scattered across multiple star systems, each group operating independently with minimal communication to Council observers. It looked like chaos to the humans. It was controlled improvisation. The first engagement came at the mining system of Kepler 442, where a Devourer vanguard was consuming the asteroid fields. The Council's standard response would have been to deploy overwhelming firepower at maximum range, attempting to destroy the enemy before they could adapt. Instead, the humans sent in a single destroyer, the Relentless, commanded by Captain Taeyang Watt, defied every tactical manual in the galaxy. Captain Taeyang engaged the Devourers at close range, using his ship's engines to create unpredictable flight patterns while firing continuously when the enemy began adapting to his weapons. He switched to ramming attacks using his ship's armored hull as a weapon. When they adapted to that, he began using the asteroids themselves as projectiles, hurling massive chunks of rock with his ship's tractor beams. The Devourers adapted to each tactic, but by the time they had figured out one approach, the humans had switched to something completely different. More importantly, each human ship was using different tactics, making it impossible for the enemy to develop universal countermeasures. What worked against one human vessel was useless against another. Captain Taeyang's ship was destroyed in the engagement, but not before he had eliminated the entire Devourer vanguard using methods that would have been considered insane by any other species. The enemy had tried to adapt to ramming attacks by strengthening their hulls, only to be destroyed by kinetic bombardment using asteroids. The creatures had never encountered an enemy willing to sacrifice their own ships as weapons. Colonel Ji-hoon led the first human ground assault on a Devourer-occupied world. While other species had tried to retake planets using conventional military doctrine, the humans approached the problem like exterminators dealing with an infestation. They used chemical weapons that broke down organic matter, nuclear charges that sterilized entire regions, and biological agents designed to disrupt the Devourers' cellular structure. When the Devourers adapted to become immune to these weapons, the humans switched to psychological warfare. They used sonic weapons that created frequencies specifically designed to disrupt the enemy's communication networks. They deployed holographic projectors that created false targets, forcing the Devourers to waste energy on phantom threats. They even used the enemy's own adaptation mechanisms against them, introducing deliberately flawed tactical data that led the creatures into traps. Major Young-soo's special operations team pioneered the tactic that would become known as evolution bombing. Instead of trying to destroy Devourer entities, they deliberately exposed them to partial information about human tactics, then withdrew before the creatures could fully adapt. The confused Devourers would then encounter other human forces using completely different approaches, creating a cascade of conflicting adaptations that crippled their effectiveness. The psychological impact on the Devourers became apparent after the first week of human engagement. The creatures, which had shown perfect coordination for months, began displaying erratic behavior. Their swarm intelligence was being overwhelmed by contradictory inputs as different groups adapted to different human tactics that were often mutually exclusive. Dr. Hyeon-ru monitored the conflict from the research vessel, Prometheus documenting the phenomenon that human military theorists had predicted the Devourer's greatest strength, their ability to learn and adapt, was becoming a weakness when faced with opponents who deliberately used illogical, contradictory, and constantly evolving tactics. The creature's collective intelligence was suffering something analogous to a nervous breakdown. The breakthrough came during the Battle of Titans. Rest, where Admiral Kyung-soo deployed the most controversial weapon in the human arsenal, the Madness Protocol. Instead of coordinated military action, human forces began using completely random tactics, with each ship's computer systems generating new attack patterns every few minutes. Some ships used weapons that had not been deployed in decades. Others used mining equipment as improvised weapons. Several ships began broadcasting random radio frequencies while painting their hulls in bright colors. To observers from other species, it looked like the human fleet had lost its collective mind, but the effect on the Devourers was devastating. Their adaptation mechanisms, designed to learn from logical tactical patterns, could not process the complete randomness of human actions. The creatures began consuming each other in confusion, their collective intelligence fragmenting as different groups tried to adapt to contradictory stimuli. Captain Yoon Seo commanded one of the ships implementing the Madness Protocol. Her vessel had been equipped with everything from ancient projectile weapons to experimental gravity manipulators. She watched in amazement as Devourer entities that had perfectly adapted to energy weapons were destroyed by simple metal bullets fired from weapons that were thousands of years old. The enemy's confusion was so complete that they began attacking each other. Different Devourer groups had adapted to different human tactics and now viewed other groups as threats. The creatures that had learned to defend against energy weapons attacked those that had adapted to kinetic attacks. The swarm that had once moved with perfect unity was tearing itself apart. Lieutenant Commander Woo Jin analyzed the enemy's breakdown from the command ship. His report showed that the Devourers were experiencing something unprecedented in their species' history. They had encountered an enemy that defied their fundamental understanding of how warfare worked. The creatures had evolved to fight logical opponents that followed predictable patterns. Humans followed no patterns at all. Major So Young led a boarding party onto a partially disabled Devourer ship using weapons that included swords, crossbows, and flamethrowers. Alongside advanced plasma rifles, the enemy had adapted to expect certain types of attacks and was completely unprepared for humans wielding medieval weapons. Alongside futuristic technology, the boarding party accomplished their mission of planting explosives while the confused Devourers tried to figure out how to defend against attacks from the Stone Age and the Space Age simultaneously. Within 6 weeks of human involvement, the Devourer advance had not only stopped but begun to reverse. The creatures were retreating toward their original territory, their swarm intelligence compromised by exposure to human warfare. But the victory came at a cost that horrified the galactic community. Human forces had used weapons and tactics that crossed every line of civilized warfare, and their casualty rates were catastrophic by any reasonable standard. Admiral Kyung-soo's fleet had lost 40% of its ships in the campaign, but had accomplished what the entire galactic military could not. The Devourers were in full retreat, their collective intelligence shattered by exposure to tactics that made no logical sense. The enemy that had adapted to every form of conventional warfare had been defeated by an opponent that refused to fight conventionally. Commander Sujin filed her final report from the medical bay, where she was recovering from injuries sustained when her ship was used as a guided missile against a Devourer installation. She noted that human tactics had succeeded not because they were superior to conventional warfare, but because they were willing to abandon the concept of warfare entirely. The human victory had come through methods that no other species would have considered deliberate sacrifice of valuable assets, use of obsolete weapons, random tactical changes that served no strategic purpose, and coordination so loose that it barely qualified as military action. The galaxy was learning that sometimes the only way to fight an adaptive enemy was to become completely unadaptable yourself. As the Devourers retreated toward the Void Sector, human forces prepared for the final assault. Admiral Kyung-soo warned the Council that the last battle would require even more extreme measures The enemy would be concentrated in their strongest position and would have learned from every encounter with human forces. The final victory would demand sacrifices that even humans found difficult to accept. The final battle took place in the Void sector, where the Devourer mothership had been growing for months. This construct was the size of a small planet and contained the collective intelligence of the entire swarm. Admiral Taemin led the combined human fleet in an assault that would determine the fate of the galaxy. But the plan he had developed would require sacrifices that even hardened human veterans found difficult to accept. Captain Hyjin commanded the volunteer squadron that would execute the final phase of the operation. Her ships had been modified with experimental weapons that would create a cascade failure in the Devourer mothership's core structure, but the modifications were unstable and the mission was effectively suicide for anyone who participated. When she called for volunteers, every human officer in the fleet stepped forward. The Devourer mothership defended itself with evolved versions of every weapon and tactic it had encountered during the war. It had learned to use human unpredictability against them, deploying random defense patterns that mirrored humanity's own chaotic fighting style. But it had made one critical error. It had tried to become more human, and in doing so had acquired human weaknesses as well as strengths. Lieutenant Commander Wu Jin analyzed the enemy's behavioral patterns from the command ship and identified the flaw that would doom the Devourers in adapting to human tactics. The creatures had developed something resembling human emotion, particularly the human tendency towards self-destruction when faced with impossible odds. They had learned to sacrifice parts of themselves for strategic advantage, but they had not learned when to stop the human fleet use this against them in the most brutal way possible. They began sacrificing their own ships in patterns that triggered the Devourers' newfound self-destructive instincts. For every human vessel that died, the enemy would sacrifice dozens of their own entities in response, trying to match the humans' apparent disregard for their own survival. Major So Young led the final assault wave, piloting a ship loaded with quantum charges that would collapse the mothership's dimensional structure. She broadcast a message to the fleet as she made her final approach, explaining that humans had always been willing to pay prices that other species could not comprehend. The Devourers had learned to adapt to human weapons and tactics, but they could not adapt to human psychology. The mothership tried every defense it had learned during the war. Energy shields that had stopped the most powerful Council weapons were overwhelmed by human ships that rammed through them at full speed. Adaptive armor that had deflected every known projectile was penetrated by humans using their own vessels as guided missiles. The creature had learned to fight like every species in the galaxy except the one that mattered. Most Captain Hyjin's squadron broke through the outer defenses using tactics that would have been impossible for any other species. Her pilots flew their ships into the mothership's weapon emplacements, accepting certain death to clear a path for the final attack. The Devourers responded by sacrificing their own defensive systems, trying to match the humans' willingness to die for victory. Dr. Minho monitored the battle from a safe distance, documenting humanity's final gambit. The quantum charges were not just weapons, they were reality bombs that would unravel the dimensional bonds holding the mothership together. But they had to be delivered from inside the creature's core, a journey that no pilot could survive. The breakthrough came when the Devourer's collective intelligence finally overloaded. The creature had absorbed too much contradictory information from human tactics and was now suffering a complete breakdown. Different parts of the mothership began working against each other as conflicting adaptations created chaos in the creature's thought processes. Major So Young reached the mothership's core and activated her quantum charges. Her final transmission was a simple statement that humans had always known the price of victory and had always been willing to pay it. The explosion that followed was visible from 17 star systems away and marked the end of the Devourer threat forever. The mothership's destruction created a chain reaction that affected every Devourer entity in the galaxy. The quantum charges had not just destroyed the creature, they had severed the dimensional bonds that connected the entire swarm. Within hours, Devourer entities throughout known space began breaking down at the molecular level. Their connection to the collective intelligence permanently destroyed the victory celebration on Sanctuary Station. was subdued by the cost of humanity's intervention. Over 40% of the human fleet had been lost in the final campaign, casualty rates that would have been unacceptable to any other species. But when council representatives expressed their horror at the losses, Admiral Taman's response was matter-of-fact. Humans had always been willing to die for victory in ways that other species could not understand. Dr. Minho presented his final report to the council 6 months after the war's end. The Devourers were extinct, their threat eliminated permanently, but he warned that humanity's methods had created precedents that could destabilize galactic civilization. Other species might try to copy human tactics, leading to conflicts that could be even more devastating than the Devourer invasion. Captain Sujin recovered from her injuries to find herself promoted to admiral, but she took no satisfaction in the honor. She had seen too many friends die in ways that served no purpose except to confuse an enemy that learned too quickly. The human victory had come through embracing everything that other species found horrifying about warfare. Commander Hyjin survived the final battle only because her ship had been disabled before she could join the suicide attack. She spent months in rehabilitation, thinking about the friends who had not been so lucky. The galaxy was safe, but the cost had been measured in the lives of people who had volunteered to die for species that had previously banned them from helping. The final council session was held 1 year after the war's end. The representatives faced a difficult decision about how to treat the species that had saved the galaxy using methods that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Some argued for new restrictions on human military action. Others demanded that humans be given permanent leadership roles in Galactic Defense. Ambassador Hanwoo's closing statement was simple and direct. Humanity would return to their previous status, accepting the same restrictions that had been placed on them before the war. They had no desire to dominate galactic politics or impose their methods on other species, but he made one final point that left the chamber in thoughtful silence. The galaxy now knew why humans had been banned from war zones in the first place, and they could decide for themselves whether that ban should ever be lifted. Again, the vote was unanimous. Humans would remain restricted from galactic conflicts, but a new emergency protocol was established. In the event of an existential threat to galactic civilization, the ban could be lifted by a 2/3 majority vote. The galaxy had learned that there were some enemies that could only be defeated by those willing to abandon all rules of civilized warfare. Lieutenant Jae-hyun was promoted to captain and assigned to monitor the new early warning systems that had been established throughout the galaxy. His job was to watch for threats that might require human intervention. Again, he hoped that such threats would never emerge, but knew that if they did, humanity would be ready to pay whatever price victory demanded. As the human delegation departed Sanctuary Station, they left behind a galaxy that was safe but forever changed. The other species had seen what humans were capable of when unleashed, and they had mixed feelings about having such allies. They were grateful for their survival, but terrified of what it had cost to achieve. The humans, for their part, returned to their space with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, knowing that they had once again proven why they were both the galaxy's greatest protectors and its most dangerous inhabitants. Dr. Hae-young published her final analysis of the war in a report that became required reading at military academies throughout the galaxy. She concluded that the Devourer threat had been defeated not through superior technology or tactics, but through humanity's willingness to embrace chaos as a weapon. The galaxy had learned that sometimes survival required abandoning every principle except the determination to live. The memorial, erected on New Sol Station, listed the names of every human who had died in the war, over 30,000 men and women who had volunteered to fight an enemy that no one else could defeat. The inscription was simple: they had died so that others might live, and in doing so had proven that humanity's greatest strength was not their weapons or their tactics, but their willingness to sacrifice everything for the survival of others. Years later, when young aliens asked their elders about the Devourer War, they would be told that it was the time when the galaxy learned the difference between fighting to win and fighting to survive. The humans had shown them that there were some threats that could only be defeated by those willing to pay any price, and that sometimes the greatest act of civilization was the willingness to abandon civilization itself.